Hello everybody, again, here we are. Hope you all are well, as always. There's not going to be a lot more videos. This may be the last lecture video where I talk about literature, but there'll be another one that talks about, just to wrap things up and to make reference to the final essay, although I'm going to do that today as well. So this particular video has sort of two parts. I'm going to talk about some poetry, and then I'm going to give you some dates for the final essay. So we're all scheduled out for the rest of the semester. First, let's talk about the literature. Now, you guys have been reading literature all semester long. We were in the classroom together for a while, and then we're home. I hope that you've had a chance to at least, or I hope throughout the semester you've gotten a little taste that writing can be something different than just what you read on the computer and in newspapers and magazines. People spend lots of time trying to make it special, whether it's a scary book or a mystery book or a suspense book or a romance novel, or it's a poem or it's a play. People are trying to do all kinds of things with words, and they're trying to get out ideas that they think are important to everybody. So, maybe we just got somebody out there, some of you out there, a little bit interested in following these things up. It's nice to have a book next to your bed, at night, even if you read 2 pages and you fall asleep. Eventually you'll finish the book. It feels good to finish a book. It feels great to finish a book. It almost feels better to finish the book than to start the book in some strange way. So, and it also helps with our language. This is true for you and me and everybody. The more reading we do, and I don't mean newspapers and computer blogs and things like that, I mean fiction. It really does help us. It helps us in terms of the way we think and the way we speak. Guaranteed. I mean, this is just true. It's a fact. Anyway, so these 3 poems, the one's called The Man He Killed. I sent you the link for that one. And the other one called Dulce et Decorum Est, which is also a link I sent you earlier today. In addition to the one that's in the book called The Death of the Ball-Turret Gunner, they're short. They are all dealing with war in one way or another. So there's a theme. Now, if this interests you, it's not just to talk about. You could take an individual poem and explicate it, as always. You can also talk, in this case, for instance, here's 3 poems from 3 different parts of history that deal with war and the effects of war and the way we think about war in very different ways. And that would make a nice comparison. Especially if you compare the way we might think about war today. All of these poems were written long before we had this, what seems to be this eternal problem with terrorism and the quote-unquote war on terrorism. So it might be interesting just to not just to talk about how they deal with it, these guys, but the way it's changed, the way our view of war, our thinking about war has changed. And using these poems and other things as examples. So, the first one, and I'll read it actually. This is one of those times it's good to read these things. So if you've got it in front of you, this is written back in of a war that took place way back in the late 18th and 19th century in I think it was Africa or something like that. And doesn't really matter. It was way back when war was fought. Again, on the ground, and people like in Braveheart, they'd come over the mountain and they'd be the bad guys, and 2 big groups of people would go and fight it out. Guns, they had guns. It wasn't ancient, but it was over 100 years ago, and so this was all on the ground, like the Civil War in the United States, just facing each other. There's the bad guy. I'm here. He's there. I got to get him. So this is this particular poem is a the narrative, personal narrative. He's the guy who's talking to someone who we don't know what the question was, but it was probably something along the lines of, so you were in the war, did you ever kill anyone? And the response, the whole poem is his response to that question. And he says, and he's talking about the man he killed, right? So, and he says to the other person, you know, had he and I but met by some old ancient inn, we should have sat us down to wet right many a nipperkin. That's like a little shot of liquor. But ranged as interesting as infantry and staring face to face, I shot at him as he at me and killed him in his place. I shot him dead because he was my foe, just so. My foe, of course he was. That's clear enough, although he thought he'd list perhaps, offhand, like, just as I was out of work, sold his traps. No other reason why. Yes, quaint and curious war is. You shoot a fellow down, you treat, if met, where any bar is, or help to half a crown. Vocabulary words. But ranged as infantry, in other words, but deciding to join the infantry unit of the army. Foe means enemy. And he thought he'd enlist, join up. He was a trapper. Trappers back in those days would go out and they would hunt for animals, kill the animals, skin them, and then sell the skins. That was a trapper. And he points out in that verse that he's just like me. Just probably joined the army because we didn't really have a real job and they gave us room and board. And half a crown is just money, like a dollar or a pound or whatever. So basically what you have here is a guy who's talking about, I killed a guy who, if we had met at any other time, we probably just would have had a beer with each other and not thought much of it. But because he was there and I was here, I had to kill him because he was the enemy and I was his enemy, though we've never met. That's startling enough. That notion is startling enough. What's also interesting, I think, is very much what we see in that Hemingway story, A Soldier's Home, that the tone of this poem is very sort of laid back. I mean, he's talking about a guy he killed, and there's nothing about it that's sort of angry or scared or upset. He's very calm. Back in those days, they called it shell shock when guys came back from the war, sort of, not quite right, sort of changed significantly. There's something about him that you might call, maybe he is a version of post-traumatic stress syndrome, PTSD, or disorder, whatever it's called. And Thomas Hardy may never even had a term for it, but he's certainly describing what ends up, in 2020 being known as something like PTSD. To be able to talk about something traumatic in such a calm way. Now you get something quite different a couple of years later with Wilfred Owen writing about World War I. And in this one he's writing a letter to a friend, and this is part of the letter. And what should be noted here is that they make a reference to mustard gas. Mustard gas was a terrible kind of a weapon used in World War I. They dropped it out of planes, it exploded, and it would burn you through the eyes and then burn you from the inside out. As a matter of fact, it was banned. You couldn't use it in war. You weren't allowed to, and if you did, you got even in more trouble than you already were. In this particular one, he is talking to those people who think that it's okay to go to war. If you look at the translation of the title on the bottom of the page, wherever you are, it says, It is sweet and proper to die for one's country, which is an old expression used by a famous philosopher named Horace. And this meant, like, for decades, for centuries, it was like fighting for your country, fighting for your land, fighting for your people was an honorable way to die. And he's taking that statement as the title of his poem so that he can say, hell no. And he does this by describing the horror of war. Bent double like old beggars under sacks, knock-kneed, coughing like hags. We cursed through sludge till the haunting flares were. We turned our backs and towards our distant rest began to trudge. Men marched to sleep. Many had lost their boots but limped on, bloodshot. All went lame, all blind, drunk with fatigue, deaf even to the hoots of tired, outstripped 5-9s that dropped behind. They were bombs. Gas, gas, quick, boys! An ecstasy of fumbling, fitting the clumsy helmets just in time. The gas masks, get them on, because the bombs were the mustard gas. But someone still was yelling out and stumbling and floundering like a man on fire or lime. Dim through the misty panes and thick green light, as under a green sea, I saw him drowning in his own blood, if you will. In all my dreams, before my helpless sight, he plunges at me, guttering, choking, drowning. This is what he sees. And then he stopped. There's a pause you see in the poem, and it's almost as if he's saying to anybody who believes that it is sweet and fitting to die for one's country, he's saying, if in some smothering dreams you too could pace behind the wagon that we flung him in and watch the white eyes writhing in his face, his hanging face, like a devil sick of sin, if you could hear at every jolt the blood come gargling from the froth-corrupted lungs, obscene as cancer, bitter as the cut of vile, incurable sores of innocent tongues, my friend, you would not tell with such high zest, with such great enthusiasm, to children, young men, ardent for some desperate glory, that is to be, they really excited to join up. You wouldn't tell them the old lie, dulce et decorum est, pro patria mori. It's a simple idea. Let me describe the horrors of war, and then I'm telling you, if you had seen what I saw, you'd never send your children off to war. It is not a glorious thing. There is nothing heroic about it. One person's opinion. Finally, the third one, which in some ways is the most graphic, I think. If you looked up what a ball turret is, and I think it says it in the book somewhere, there used to be planes back in World War II that had this semicircular plexiglass space to sit that had a machine gun in it. And guys would volunteer or get ordered to sit there and shoot the bad guy when the skies were up, when you're flying in the skies against the bad guys. It was the suicide mission. You were out there completely exposed to all of this. Again, try to picture a plane with a circular, like a belly. Inside the belly, the guy is sitting with a machine gun. What's interesting about this poem as opposed to the others is that the voice of this poem is dead. He's speaking from beyond the grave. From my mother's sleep, I fell into the state, and I hunched in its belly till my wet fur froze. 6 miles from earth, loosed from its dream of life, I woke to black flak and the nightmare fighters. And when I died, they washed me out of the turret with a hose. So he gets killed, the plane lands, they hose out his remains. Somebody else gets in and does the same thing all over again. Again, a couple of things, and again, I wish we had more time in the classroom to have a Q&A here, but here are things to know about, and you can think of it any way you like. One is the tone. Again, this tone of this poem is very much like the tone of the first one, the Thomas Hardy one. The guy does not sound particularly excited or upset. Talks about, yeah, I was up there, I got shot, I'm dead. When I died, they hosed me out. You'd think he would be a little bit more upset about this ordeal, but he's not. Part of the reason for that is because from the first line we know that he's enlisted into the army when he's still young. Don't forget, a 17 or 18-year-old boy is still a boy. And the older you get, the older you're going to start looking at people who were 16 and 17 and 18. Even now, I'll bet you think some of your high school kids look like babies. It happens quickly. But he goes from being a young boy, 18 or 17, and boom, right into the army. So he goes from one mother to another, if you will. The government took over. That's what I mean by the state. From his mother's sleep, his mother's womb, if you will, to the state. So he went two mothers, if you want to look at it that way. And I hunched in its belly till my wet fur froze. Interesting image. Again, that ball turret. It looks like the belly of the airplane, like the belly of a pregnant mother. And he's hunched inside till his wet fur froze. The wet fur has two meanings. One is like the bomber jacket that they used to wear, the fur on the bomber jackets, but also a fetus inside a womb of a woman at some point during the pregnancy is covered with a lot of hair, little fur, if you will. And they lose it and then they're born. But during that time, during the period of time that they're a fetus, they are in there. And then, of course, 6 miles from Earth, up in the sky, they get attacked, he gets killed, and he's washed out of the turret. The image of a plane with a plexiglass compartment, circular compartment to sit in that spun around, it's hard not to think of the pregnant belly of a woman and the death of the fetus being cleaned out like some abortion methods. And again, Randall Jarrell, the poet here, has no mercy about war. He calls war a country aborting its young men and women. And he gives you the image of the equipment they used to actually fight the war in World War II. But he has us thinking, because of the imagery, of an abortion happening. Those young men are being aborted. They never really get a chance to live their lives. They go from being a little baby with mommy at home to being a babe of the state, and then they're killed. Which is why we don't get any emotion from the voice of the guy, because he hasn't really matured yet. So you get three very different views of war. One where in the first one he becomes sort of desensitized. In the second one he's freaking angry. And he wants to just shake anybody who thinks it's fitting to die for one's country. And in the last one you get a man who is absolutely refuses to think of it as anything but a murder in his mind, an abortion, aborting perfectly healthy men and women to die for, in his eyes, to die for nothing. The young fella Krebs in Soldier's Home by Hemingway, the short story that we read weeks ago, he comes home, you might argue he's much like the first guy, sort of a PTSD type fellow. And you may have other songs that you know that deal with war, or movies that you've seen that deal with it, you could make a reference to and how they look at this. War is something that we all know, but we've been living since all of us have been alive, we've been at war somewhere. So it's not something we don't know a little bit about. Some of you may know people who've done tours of duty in Afghanistan and Iraq and things, and have other thoughts about it. In any event, all of that's food for thought for a paper if you want it. Speaking of the last paper, you know what you need to do. We've gone through what to think about, everything from the last essay, which was week 12, from 13, 14, 15, and 16, weeks 13 to 16, all of those, the plays, the short stories, the poetry especially, everything you have to choose from. Here are the dates you need to know. So I'm going to be looking for ideas for a paper. Throw them out there. Give me one or two if you want. I'll get back to you. And I'll always ask you, what is your point, right? And I want all those ideas no later than the 3rd of May. That's coming up in a few days. Okay, you can send them to me today, tomorrow, but no later than the 3rd. I want to see those ideas so I can at least get you started thinking about what to do. Then I want the introductions with your thesis no later than the 8th of May. And again, you can send them earlier than the 8th of May, 7th of May, 6th of May, 5th of May, but no later than the 8th. All right, so we've got time for these things. This is not right away. And then the final draft of the paper will be done the week after, will be due no later than the 16th of May. So the ideas for your paper by no later than the 3rd, the introductions no later, with the thesis no later than the 8th, and the final draft no later than the 16th. And that's our schedule for the rest of the semester. If you have any questions, of course, email me and we'll talk through the discussion board. I'll get those things up sometime today. If they're not there right now when you see it, they'll be up there shortly after. So keep watching, okay? Stay well. We'll talk again. Peace, everybody.